A demure cap, and she's got a pickaxe right here. Now, I've just moved to the Netherlands. Everything is strange to me. I still haven't learned the language. I still haven't figured out what the hell I'm going to do here. I'm just completely lost. And the way I deal with being lost is that I research things. So I've started to research Dutch history. So I'm really interested at this painting, and I go, okay, who is this? And so I start reading, and it says, this woman's name is Trine van Lampert, and she attacked the Spanish castle in Utrecht. And I kind of stopped and I was like, wait a second. I read about this, but it was in Haarlem. What? So of course I, like we all do, I got out my phone and I started to Google. And I found oh no, there was actually a woman in Haarlem as well. These are two different people. So I was so excited because I write about women's history. So I go chat with my friend who's an old Amsterdammer, and I tell him I'm so excited because I learned about Trine van Lamperts and I learned about Comedyhuis Hasselaar. And he kind of smirks a little bit when I say Kino. And not because of my accent, although if you speak Dutch, I'm sure you're smirking at my accent as well. But he kind of smirks when I say Kino. And he's like, you actually, so you probably shouldn't say Kino. And I'm like, why? And he's like, well, it kind of means it's a bad name for a woman. It's like, a woman who's really he's a theater person, so he says Tammy of the Shrew, and I'm a theater person, so I understand what that means. But basically he means a virago, like a woman who tries to take on a male role. And I was really shocked because I've read at this point about the siege of Haarlem, and it was horrible. People in Haarlem were really suffering. The Spanish siege had cut off all food. They were starving, and there was a lot of violence being inflicted on civilians at a time where usually if you weren't a French peasant, there wasn't as much violence towards civilian and warfare. So it was really shocking the way the Spanish were treating the people of Haarlem. And Comedyhuis Hasselaar led this group of women in fighting against the siege. And so I couldn't quite understand how that had translated to a bad word. I felt like I had to have been missing something. And so I did more research, and I found out that actually, during the 80 Years' War, there were women in just about every city that were leading the resistance. Trine van Lamperts isn't even the only Trine to have led a resistance. There was one in Alkmaar, I think, named Trine Rembrandts. So I wasn't going to tell you guys this story at all. I had this whole Blue Monday thing planned. And even when I was looking up how to get here and seeing that we were going through the district that Trine van Lamperts led this group of women through on their way to destroy the Spanish castle, I was like, oh, that's kind of interesting, but I wasn't going to tell you guys about this. But then when I got to work, I had to go on social media, and I saw that there's a group of white nationalists walking through Richmond right now, holding guns openly. And that made me realize that I have to tell you a version of that story that comes from my country. So in 1840, the South has been living off of slave labor for hundreds of years at this point, and most of the people who own slaves are actually very, very wealthy. And it's in the interest of these very, very wealthy people to convince everyone else that slavery is natural and that slavery is what's supposed to be happening, because if everybody else isn't convinced of that, then not only will the economy fall apart, but they won't be rich and powerful anymore. So they really need to, there's scientists that are hired and doctors that are hired to try and write these, bullshit ideas about why slavery is normal. And there are some people who disagree, but the tension's been ramping up for years and years between abolitionists who want to destroy slavery and the people who really want to hold on to their power. And so the people who really want to hold on to their power are dug in, to the point that there's not actually a way to free a slave. So in the 1840s, there was a woman who inherited a smaller farm from her father, and she was an abolitionist. She didn't believe in slaves, and she didn't want to inherit people. So she tried to free them, except she couldn't. There was literally no way for her to give these people what God had given them, their right to exist outside of bondage. So she kind of just went under the cover of the law. She did what she could to get people out if they wanted to get out, and she kept a home for the people who, they were all working together, but she kind of kept them going. And there was this little girl who was so smart. She was just like the kind of mind that doesn't come along very often. So Elizabeth, the woman who'd inherited this farm, sent this little girl to school up north. And she sent her to a Quaker school because that was the only place that would teach a black girl. And Mary just excelled. She had one of those minds where like she could see something once and then that was it. She had it memorized. She never had to look at it again. She just soaked in knowledge like a sponge, and soon she'd learned everything that she could learn at that school. And then there was nowhere for her to go. She did go back to Elizabeth's house, but Elizabeth's house was in the South at a slave state in Virginia as they were ramping up towards war. So Elizabeth actually got her on a mission trip all the way to Liberia. And Mary went to Liberia, but she felt like something was wrong. She felt like she needed to fix what was happening where she was born. So Mary came back, and she lived with Elizabeth, and she worked to try and help the other slaves. And she got married. She found a nice man, and they got married under the cover of Virginia law. And then the war broke out. And Elizabeth went from really kind of advocating the abolition of slavery and really getting in her neighbor's face and really like kind of being a gadfly to everyone in Richmond, Virginia. When the war started, something seemed to flip. And she started acting like a crazy person. I mean, she was like walking down the street in her shift. She was just like speaking to the sky. And so everyone kind of stopped noticing Elizabeth because like it was clear that Elizabeth she'd always been halfway crazy, and it was real clear that she'd gone all the way around the bend. And what had actually happened is Elizabeth had started setting up a spy ring to smuggle information out of Richmond, Virginia, and into the North. And the key of that spy ring was this little girl who'd now grown into a young woman. Elizabeth got her placed as a slave in the house of the man who was running the Confederacy, running the slave state in the South. And of course, this man who was running the slave state owned many slaves himself, so he needed in his guts to believe that slaves couldn't read, that slaves were incapable of reason, that slaves didn't have the kind of intelligence necessary to do espionage. So he broke his inner circle apart, trying to figure out where the leak was. Because they knew that information was just disappearing from his office, that they'd say something with just them in the safety of his house. And then suddenly it was like the North knew. And he couldn't figure out why that was happening. And he fired one person, he accused another person, he demoted another person, and they even eventually hired someone to try and figure out who the mole was. And meanwhile, the woman who's cleaning up the fire, cleaning the ashes out of the fireplace, takes one look at the map as it's laid out on his desk. And that's all she needs. She goes back, she does a little quick handwritten map, and she sews it into the hem of a garment that she then sends to the laundress. The laundress is part of Elizabeth's ring. The laundress unpicks it, gets it to Elizabeth, who gets it to the North. I cannot tell you how many battles and how many crucial campaigns hung on the knowledge that these women got out of the Confederate White House. And I cannot tell you how furious Mary Bowser's husband was at this. Because imagine someone you love. Like, it's one thing, when you're talking about heroism, it's one thing to sacrifice yourself. It's one thing to say, there are things that I am willing to die for. It's quite another thing to watch someone you love say that. It was a source of quite a lot of conflict between Mary and her husband, but she felt like she had to do it. And she only finally stopped doing it when it was really clear that this investigator had gone through everyone else in Jefferson Davis's circle. And sooner or later, he was about to get the inevitable. So Mary slipped away, and she went back to her husband. And just a little bit later, the Union Army, the North, invaded Virginia. And I wish this was a happier story. Maybe it is a Blue Monday story. But unfortunately, what has happened in many, many wars happened here. The soldiers who, let's remember, were under a banner of trying to end slavery, the soldiers entered Richmond, Virginia with bloodlust in their eyes. And they attacked people left and right. We don't know for sure that Mary was telling her own story, but I think it's pretty clear that she was. She told a story later, after the war, of a husband being beaten up and the wife begging for his life. I think she was talking about herself and her husband, and I think it must have been shocking for her, after being the one to run these risks, to actually watch her husband in danger. Mary and Elizabeth both survived the war, and just as what happened with Trine and Kinau and the other Trine and Margarita and Magdalena and a bunch of other names that I could be here all day saying, instead of being celebrated, no one wanted to talk about it. And there were reasons with the Dutch Republic, and there were reasons with Reconstruction. Elizabeth actually ended up begging the War Department to give her their records because she was terrified that a former Confederate would get at the records in the War Department, and she and everyone who'd been part of her ring would be killed for it. Elizabeth kind of struggled after the war because she'd spent all of her money on this spy ring, and then the North, now that they'd won, refused to reimburse her for it. Mary, as I said, went on this lecture circuit where she was telling stories of what happened before the war. But those, oh my goodness. But those lectures were never as fully attended as the lectures from white abolitionists. And the last record that we have of Mary is of her running a school very deep in the South. It was the only school in the area for Black girls. So she was teaching. She was passing on everything that she'd learned. And the white abolitionists who found this school wrote this kind of nice letter. They didn't call her by name. They never mentioned her by name. They didn't actually support the school, but they were like, oh, isn't it nice that this nice woman is doing this? And by the way, we're going to go raise money for a white organization. And I say all that because I think that we lose something really important when we don't look at all of our history. I think that when Kinau Hassler's name has become a bad word, I think we've lost something. In my country, when we don't know about women like Elizabeth Van Loo and Mary Bowser, that's how we end up with ignorant people walking the streets. So thank you for listening to the story, and I hope you tell other people about it.
Yes.